accomplished stragglers come in, but we're going to do this. So welcome to all of our visitors from afar to the Southern Ohio Museum and Cultural Center. I am Charlotte. Oh, I forgot to get my name tag. I was going to go get it off my desk. My husband, Mark Chep, who doubles as a bartender, is the executive director. And so we are co-directors here, and I really welcome all of you all here. As always, we start out thanking our sponsors. We really thank the Ohio Arts Council and the Scioto Foundation. We would not be open without them. And this year, we are also thanking the Small Business Administration because they kept us afloat during COVID. And I thank our executive director, Mark Chep, for writing all of those grants that kept us all open and the entire staff paid. So, we've got a few board members here today. I want to thank the board members and former board members for being here and always supporting us. You know, when I started out as a really young curator, I kind of had this notion, oh, you only show an artist once. And then, like, not many years into that, and maybe it was all my years in art school, I realized artists' works grow and change, and you really miss a lot if you only show them once. So, back for repeat performance, we've got Naysan McIlhargey here. And when was that, 2018, 2017 that you were here before?
It's been longer, I think.
Longer
five or 6 years.
Right, yeah. And it was an incredible body of work then. And this is a really wonderful body of work to show. It's a very personal group of wares that Naysan has created. And as I say in my statement, most people, when they want to really research their ancestry, send a swab off to Ancestry DNA or something like that. And Naysan instead has turned to museum collections, which I think in itself is really amazing. As museum people, to have these works here is like having loans from all over the world because these originals are in museums all over the world. So Naysan, most of you all know him, is Miami Valley Pottery in Yellow Springs. If ever you are in Yellow Springs, stop by if you haven't already. It's an incredible visit. To see your space and your studio. I thank your family, all of them, for being here and joining us today. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you so much for having the work. I wanted to talk about a couple of things that relate to this show. The first is that this body of work is the result of COVID, basically. The fact that we last year in March were forced to shut down, and try to imagine yourself back then, what the emotions were, what you were thinking about, how you were trying to balance your family, the children, the routines that you had. So my wife and family and my children and I were in London, England. My wife was getting a PhD, so we were there when the lockdown happened. So this collection was a body of work that I was able to spend during the duration of lockdown. So it was essentially, I think, I was talking to Jelana about this earlier today, I think it was from March 15th until the middle of June in London that we were stuck in place and that we had to stay in our apartment. So I had, leading up to that middle of March, I had I foresaw a little bit what might happen, so I was able to produce a bunch of plates and platters, and I was able to bisque fire them and bring them to the apartment. With that in mind, I basically indulged myself. It was a 4-month therapy to do the research while we were in our apartment. So the way I was able to do it, I've done a study of Persian ceramics before, but I had at my fingertips, the first time I had a library of books at my home in Yellow Springs. And from the libraries, I was able to use books. This time I was forced to do everything on my phone, but you can do a lot on your phone. There's a lot of museum websites that are really well document these works all over the world. So that was where I was able to access the original works from. So imagine COVID, the stress of not knowing what's going to happen, the uncertainty of health of your family. But this was therapy for me, and it was a form of research in my profession, in my field, where I was able to really access the skills that I wasn't typically using in my normal body of work. Because normally I'm a production potter, and I don't spend as much time on individual pieces with this kind of detail. So because we had the time, and we were stuck, and I had these things to decorate, I really did a lot of research. And the result you can see is a little more detailed and diverse maybe than some of the other work that I normally do. So this body of work, like I said, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this catalog. I only have a couple copies of it now here. There will be more later. But I want you, if you have time, there's one downstairs to look at. I wanted to talk about some of what Charlotte mentioned as a reference. The background that I have, my mother's from Iran, so the Persian background that I have, but also the fact that it's part of my heritage, and being a potter, you want to do the best you can. You want to aim for perfection in the best way you know how to do it. And part of this was researching the history of Persian ceramics, which the beauty has been done already. The works are in museums, and they're in museums for a reason. They are some of the best pieces of work from world ceramics that are kept in time in museums. So the beauty of the work itself was already done. My job was to learn about it, learn about the stories behind each piece, where they come from, which museum they're in, and try to do that in my own way. And these are not replicas, these are not even attempts to try to make the exact piece, because the original pieces are totally different shapes. It's to try to understand how they were able to come up with these designs, whether it's with geometry in pattern, whether it's use of mythical stories from Persian epic poems. But part of the research that I was able to learn about is the fact that in the now they say the Persianate world, there are kiln sites that are dotted around, whether it's in Syria or in Iran or in Iraq or Afghanistan. There are kiln sites that go back hundreds and hundreds of years that produce particular kinds of work, okay? Some of them are still active, but they were producing thousands of these kinds of pieces that, for example, you see pieces like this. This is from a period called Mine ware, which the technique that is used in Farsi is called haft rang. So they typically use 7 colors in their decorations. The imagery is often people on horseback, seated figures, and you'll see them in some of the other pieces. But that's from a particular place, a particular time, and it's bookended by, oftentimes, the Mongol invasion. Okay, so you can imagine the cultures change with war, with the influence of the Silk Road, and in ceramics you can see these changes happen because it's documented in the work itself, okay? So other pieces might be influenced by, like I said, geometry, but whether it's from the mathematicians, the physics, people who study physics in Cairo or Baghdad, you can see how they translate into ceramics and where they end up in these kiln sites, okay? So part of the work for me was to learn more about it because it's part of my heritage, but it's also part of my, not responsibility, but my privilege to not teach you, but to hopefully to show you, if you're unable to go to, if you're not able to go to the Victoria and Albert Museum and see the original piece that is housed in the museum, we can learn about it in the discussion and in this catalog, hopefully that you'll see, because in the back there are references from the original pieces and where they are in the museums around the world. That particular piece is a unique one in the corner because right before lockdown, I would go to the Victoria and Albert Museum almost 2 or 3 or 4 times a week because the kids would be in school and I would have time to go. Between that and going to the studio, I would go to the museum because it's one of the best collections in the world. But part of their collection there is the fact that they have a ceramic study room where you can request from the curators to physically, they bring the piece to you in the room, you put gloves on and you can look at the pieces, you can handle the pieces. So this is one of the pieces that I was able to study because I still, even after having tried to work on this piece, I still don't understand how they were able to do it. It's mathematically, it's a wonder. So I held the piece, I was able to look at it, I took several pictures. Part of what I noticed was that this is a famous piece in a museum, right? I didn't know until I held it in my hand that it was shards. It was in hundreds of pieces. You don't know this necessarily unless you get really close to the piece in the museum. So I got to hold the piece and I spent probably almost a week on that particular piece because I didn't know how to do it. It's that complicated. So let's see what else. I wanted to talk too about the catalog. Like I said, there's only a couple of these now, but we'll have hundreds of them that we'll have available for people later. The catalog has some, not all the pieces in the show, but like I said, in the back, it references the original where it's located. Okay, so you can get a sense of where these pieces come from all over the world. Let's see. Any questions? I'll think of a couple other things I might want to say, but do you guys have any questions technically about the work or the inspiration? Like I said, I think Charlotte does a very good job of discussing the fact that this is part of my upbringing, part of my heritage, part of my culture. And then in this catalog also, there's an essay from Charlotte, but also there's an essay from a professor at Miami who has the same last name as you.
No relation.
Matthew Gordon, his specialty is Islamic art, but his specific specialty is in this period of work in. This is fascinating. He doesn't actually talk about it in the essay, but he specializes in the depiction of slave women in the history of Persian literature and art, and trying to understand it. Okay, there's a lot to that, and there's a lot that's not known. But so that's his specialty. But he wrote a very interesting essay in here about how this body of work is in a historical context. Okay, so I hope people get a chance to look at this. Okay, any questions? Emily?
I had a question about your process. So the last show that we had here of yours, it was wood fire pottery, and I'm not difference between these ceramics and what you were creating before?
Okay, great question. All of this work was made, and except for this yellow piece in the middle here, that was fired at our kiln in Yell Springs in the wood kiln. That's wood fired. But all the other ones were fired in London in an electric kiln, which is, for me, it's a foreign world. It's a different technique. It's a different way of firing that I'm not that familiar with. So all of these pieces technically go through a process. They go through a first firing called bisque firing. It takes them up to a medium range temperature so they're hardened. So that allows me to transport them with my little granny cart in London from the studio to the apartment, okay? And they won't break. I wrap them with bubble wrap, but they won't break because they're not as fragile. So that's bisque firing. They get glazed, well, they get decorated and then glazed and then fired to a high temperature, a medium to high range temperature. So these were fired to what's the equivalent of cone 8 or 9. Okay, so that it's a pretty high temperature.
2200.
Yeah,
2200. Yeah.
Whereas the yellow piece is fired into a kiln that's 2500 degrees. It's a hotter kiln, hotter fire.
And a different atmosphere.
Different atmosphere. Electric kiln is very controlled. There's oxidation, so there's plenty of oxygen in the kiln, and it's very consistent. So in some ways, this body of work benefits from the fact that there's consistency. There's one unique piece, which is the first piece that I did in that room. It's the small plate. That was the first piece I did, and I fired it too hot. And there's a different look to it. The decoration ran a little bit. So I learned from that one singular piece that was fired in a kiln to soak the kiln for a shorter period of time at the end. And then the rest of this benefited from it. But it's actually an interesting and beautiful piece in itself because it got hotter. But in the wood kiln, all bets are off. You never know what's going to happen. It's all hot, right? So.
Well, it's all hot, but then there's not. So an electric kiln, it's like your oven, and that the air is in there, and it just gets hot, and then it cools down. But in your wood kiln, the wood is burning away the oxygen. So when you say, like, the whole atmosphere within that oven chamber changes. And so the air wanting oxygen turns to the glaze and pulls out the O2 that's within all of your chemicals.
Right.
And so it will change the look, and also there is free-floating carbon, so it does get darker as well.
And that process is called reduction, and it is a chemical process. It happens because of the atmosphere in the kiln and the need for oxygen to burn the wood. It takes it out of the glaze and it takes it out of the clay. Okay, so that's reduction. In oxidation, everything's stable and there's plenty of oxygen and it doesn't vary much. Okay, so every time you stoke a piece of wood in the kiln, it goes reduction, oxidation, oxidation. So it's a constant change in the fire.
And so if I can interject here, in my museum, with my museum hat on, when you have ceramic artists that have spent their life firing in one way, in one temperature, in one atmosphere, to see an artist totally change that atmosphere and temperature and create an entire body of work that is then amazingly like this successful as well. It's really amazing to see an artist feel comfortable enough to change,
right,
to make that whole pivot.
Well, I think part of I guess the interesting part for me as an artist during lockdown, there wasn't much comfort. You know, we were forced in an uncomfortable space, and part of that discomfort was not knowing how these were going to turn out. So I really was not sure what was going to happen.
So you use really pleasant mangelata, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I do have to thank my wife for allowing me to do this while she was helping with the kids.
All right, we have a question from the audience.
It's more of a comment, but just to point out, I think about a quarter of the pots that he puts in his kiln don't make it out, or maybe more. And also, when we were in London, he locked the door and didn't let us in when
That's not
Double lock.
I say, I think we all went to that period during lockdown.
Yes,
We all went through that.
No, but there is an image Jelana took of me because I would sit with my headphones on and listen to a book on tape or whatever, and I was doing all my research on the phone, so she took a picture and sent it to our foster daughter in Madagascar of me sitting there, and it's an image that I didn't see of myself, but it's clear that I was in my own little world during all this. Yeah.
In a flat that is about the size of this room.
Yeah.
It's important.
Yeah. Yeah, David.
So the other thing about the difference between wood-fired kilns and electric is the coloration. Is that right? Speak to the fact that in a wood-fired kiln, it's very difficult to get bright, vibrant colors, whereas an electric kiln, it's much easier. And the original pieces that you're emulating were done in wood-fired kilns.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Okay, there's a lot to that question. There's a lot packed in there. The original pieces, imagine 800 years ago, they didn't have a ceramic supply store that they could go and buy every single material that they wanted. Cobalt was invented in the Middle East, and porcelain was invented in China 1,000 years ago, and wars were fought over these materials. Literal wars, okay? So the materials were much harder to get. They did understand what they were and what they did in the kilns, but they were not accessible. They weren't easy to get, okay? With electric firing, you're right, the colors tend to keep and they're stable, and you can get almost every color in an electric kiln, even at a high temperature. In a wood kiln, the technology now is better than it was 20 years ago, where they have what's called encapsulated stains, where they trap pigments of material of color in zircon balls, and you put that in the pigment and you paint that on, and it keeps it stable in the kiln, and the atmosphere doesn't affect it that much. But in the wood kiln, there's a limit to it. There's a limit to how many colors you can get. Even with that, a lot of the colors burn out because we just fire so hot. Allison.
I guess first I just want to say congratulations again. This is a really stunning show, Naysan, and I think it's particularly striking during a time when we were all so separate and isolated to have a show that really speaks to our connectivity across time and culture. So that's just a huge accomplishment, and I'm really excited to get to be here to see it in person. I think along those lines, one of the most interesting and compelling parts of the work, of course, is the technical success that you had and the sense of experimentation that you were doing, but also that these pieces have such rich stories, and you alluded to that when you said you used to visit the museums and kind of get to know as if it were a friend or a community that you were trying to learn more about and connect with. So I just wonder if you could tell us today one of the stories that was most meaningful or striking to you from this body of work.
Yeah, that's a great, thank you. Those are nice words. So the piece behind Alex and Jake there is the one with the camel and the bow and arrow. That's maybe the elder Iranians here can help me with this, but that's a famous Bahramgur and Azadeh, right? You guys, come on. Okay, I'll do my best. So this is from the famous Persian, the Shahnameh, the story of kings, and Bahramgur was a prince, and Azadeh was his lover, his concubine, his mistress. He was challenged to shoot a deer with one arrow through both ears and kill it, and then she criticized him afterwards. And am I right by saying this? I think he kills her.
Yeah. Oh, sounds perfect.
Okay? Because he criticized her. But it's a famous story, And when you look it up on the internet, there's metal work that's done, there's wood, there's tons of manuscripts, paper. It's a famous story that's done hundreds and hundreds of times in museums all over the world, in different mediums, okay? So that's based on a piece that's at the Metropolitan Museum. That's one of many that are done with that imagery.
I think I'm just to add to the story. While we were in London, these were hanging in our flat.
Yeah.
And they were all around our flat. And we were in the process of leaving London, so we were giving everything away, which in London requires you just announcing on the website that you're giving everything away, and people start coming to your flat to pick it up. And this woman walked by and started talking to Naysan, and the next thing we know, she came into the flat to see the work, and she had done her master's thesis
Yeah.
and at Yale on that particular
Yeah.
amazing.
Let's also
Okay, no.
Wait, I want to say one other thing to Allison about that. The other thing I would say about the richness of the stories that are embedded in these works, and it's amazing. Every single one of these pieces in the museum has a story to it, and it may come from an epic poem. It may come from imagery that's done on pieces on tile, for example. A lot of these are based on tile. But let's see. I was going to say one other thing. I forgot it. I forgot it. But that I appreciate what you're saying, because I think that's why these pieces in museums are so well respected, because they, like you said, technically they're done, like they were done really well, but it's more about the story that each piece tells. Because like I could talk about every single one of these and where they are and why they're unique and the stories behind them, but there's just so many, because it's from 1,000 years of history, you know? It's mind-boggling. Great.
The curation is awesome. And did you curate this, or?
So, well, we took the body of work. And so, this is a public space. We have the elevator, and so we kind of blocked it off, and Emily and I unpacked them. And it really was, my dad, as a young girl, my dad would read me the Arabian Nights, and I came back later that night and turned on the gallery lights just to be with them, because I mean, the story quality of them is so rich. And it is kind of whenever I do a layout of work, I like to come back when nobody else is here and let the work make its own connections to kind of do a layout. So, and I kind of do these little groupings. But thank you. I mean, it was just an incredible body of work. And knowing Naysan for this long and knowing the history of his work, it made it even more special. To me personally, as a ceramic artist as well, I was really in awe of them.
I want to say also one thing. When I was doing this body of work, during it and afterwards, I was trying to find a place in London to show the work, and I did a lot of research. I called hundreds of places, and I was turned down by every single place, and it was very discouraging. Partly because of COVID, but also the world was so uncertain, they didn't know how to handle some random American calling and saying, hey, I have this body of work. So we came back last July, and I had a firing and a kiln sale, and Charlotte shows up, and I showed her some of the examples that I had brought home, and she, at that time, said, bring them here and we'll show them at the museum. So a lot of credit to Charlotte for risking that without even having seen the work.
It was a calculated risk. And what would you like to add?
I was gonna say, could you explain a bit more about how the ash puts texture on the pots in the wood firing?
Oh, yeah. The wood firing is marked by the wood ash and the flame and the heat. And there's some of that in the yellow piece, but if you come to our pottery, you'll see more of it. Each piece is marked by the flame. We don't want me to point that out.
Right. Well, I think to Emil's earlier point that in ceramic arts, you do lose a lot to the firing process, to just the process itself. And so whenever you do see ceramics, no matter what century it was fired in, it represents, a percentage, like what you're seeing is just a percentage of what was actually created.
Okay, I just remembered what I wanted to say.
Go for it.
Thanks to Charlotte. In the research, there's a fascinating story about when you research lusterware. Luster is a fascinating technique that is done, it's fired to a high temperature, you go back and you paint the colors on it, and you add metal oxides to give it, you fire it again to a lower temperature, to give it the appearance of, at the time, glass, to emulate glass, to try to come up with the richness and color of gold and silver and glass. Okay, that's what they were trying to do. There's a fascinating story about a potter who had a collection of this work, very successful. Let's say it was in 13th century, and saw the Mongols coming, was worried, buried all of his work, thinking that he'll come back in a couple weeks or a couple months and put them back out for sale or whatever to reclaim them. They sat there for 900 years in the ground.
How did they extract them from the ground then?
Well, they were found late. They were found in the early 20th century. They were excavated, and it's like a treasure trove of pots. And now they're in museums around the world. But just imagine that as part of the history of that body of work, because it's the uncertainty of what's happening at the time with war and clans coming and decimating. Bye, you guys. Thank you so much for coming. So I read that, and I was blown away by that.
That is an amazing story.
Any other questions?
Well, I got one. So, do you have a sense of how much work like this happens now? Have you been in communication with other artists, or like in the process of researching, replicas, and just wondering about how this sits in this current time?
That's a good question.
That's a good question. I did find, let's see, I'm not sure how to talk about this carefully, but when I was reaching out to people to show the work, in the ceramic field, some people are nervous about showing this work because it can come off as replicas. I don't like to use the word as replica because that's not what I'm trying to do. There are people in the world that do replicas, and they do it in a way that is deceiving, and painters do that. There's famous stories about fakes that are painted around the world. And they find the guy that did it, and he says, I sold my painting for under $1,000, and it's legal, and then whoever buys, there's ways to get around it. There are fakes out there. Like I said, I'm not trying to fake these because they're nothing actually like the originals. This is for me as a study. This is for me to try to understand what they were doing, how they did it, where these designs came from. There are people, though, that are doing it in a much more interesting and creative way. There's a British tile artist who I came across, who I've seen his work in books since then, but I came across first because he was represented by a gallery that sells real high-end Persian antiques, like really, really high-end Persian in London. but they represent him as a current artist because his work is the perfect translation of imagery that's from the old days onto tile that are luster tile that are exquisite. And they're now in museums now because his work in itself is so beautiful. So there are people that are doing it. There's a couple of artists that I follow in Iran that are doing replica lusterware that are, I mean, they're beautiful. And they look a lot like the originals. So it's not like there's a lot of gray area in there. So that's why I say I don't really know how to answer it. Yes, Mom.
Is the show going to go someplace else? That's number one. Number two, are these pieces for sale?
I guess I should talk about that.
No and no.
This body of work will go from here. We'll go to the Winds Cafe in Yellow Springs. I do a show there every 2 years. And I had planned, when I decided to bring this, to show that as part of my show in November and December. The idea is that I'll start selling the work then. That's the idea. That's the plan.
Thank you.
Plans change though, I don't know what's going on. But that's coming up, that's in 2 weeks actually. That show will go up in 2 weeks and it'll be there from November 8th until December 31st.
Is there an opening reception?
There will be, we haven't decided yet when, but there will be a reception also. Did I
All right.
do okay?
Yes.
Any other last questions? Yes.
Do you have an idea of what is the oldest design up to the most modern of
Yes.
this type of design?
Okay, let me just do a quick walkthrough, because I think I know the answer, but I have to see them all first. The most recent one, we can start with that, is the image that's on this catalog there, the platter on the second from the left. And
What date?
and the image of the woman holding the cup. Those are based on tile. Both of them are based on tile that are from the 17th and 18th century. Those are the most recent inspirations. The oldest, I think the oldest might be this one here. It's all around the 9th century. So this one is the end of the 9th century, and it's at a museum in Cairo, the Islamic Museum in Cairo, and it's a bowl, a luster. So I would say the earliest ones, there might be one over there too, that's from the middle 9th century, but that's kind of as far back as I go. This is kind of like the renaissance of Persian ceramics. You can see where it starts. The ceramics before that is much more crude, maybe more loose geometric patterns, doesn't have as rich imagery, and it's still beautiful. But it, because of all the influences that come into the Middle East during that time, they were influenced by so many different cultures, and that's why you have this like richness during that, let's say, 10th through 15th century.
Back to the issue of color.
Yeah.
With much or some of the work, is it reflective of the coloration of the pieces on which they're imaged? And do they have plates of orange color?
No.
From Iran. So that's not at
Well,
all.
these the middle one is from Syria. The one on the right is from what they call Mesopotamia, from Baghdad, and the one on the left is also from the Iraq area. All three of those were originally done in luster. So the luster is, I didn't want to buy luster because it's kind of toxic and it's a technique that I don't know anything about. And those have the metal oxides in them to emulate the original kind of luster, and you can do a pretty good job of it. But this is more, I'm not good with color, so it's supposed to be like a gold a gold color. You're laughing? But I wasn't trying to get those exact because I knew that I wouldn't. So I actually like the fact that those are bright orange because it's different. They stand out a little bit more maybe than the originals.
Sorry, I have a question, because you just raised, some of this is from Syria, so current conflict zones, and I was just wondering if there are any pieces, or if you wanted to talk about what had happened.
Yeah. Oh man, it's heartbreaking. Yeah. Several of the pieces in this are based on works from Syria, from Raqqa, Syria. So Charlotte's standing next to the second piece in, the first on that wall, the one to the left of that. That one, the peacock up here, they call it a peacock, the one on top, those are from Raqqa, Syria. And I don't know what to say. I mean, it's heartbreaking, you know? There's pieces that are from Afghanistan, like originally from Afghanistan.
Are they destroying them, or are they?
Well, the ones that are in museums now are safe, but I mean, you think that some of the museums have been destroyed, or the works have been taken out of museums, and who knows where they are now, the works. Some of them have been taken to other museums. But it's heartbreaking. It's so sad.
Is there a black market for that?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, then we could talk about how museums acquired their work to begin with. I mean, that's a big topic right now, you know?
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question? And Donald, and maybe this is kind of off topic. So the war, this is from a region that has seen war for generations. And I know in the rug industry, just the whole notion of war has impacted rugs, and you can get Afghan war rugs, and they date them by what tanks are on them. And have you ever seen that? They're woven with different tanks, and sometimes they're Russian, and sometimes they're U.S. and arms. Have you seen any reflection of that in the ceramic, contemporary Middle Eastern ceramics?
Contemporary?
Yeah, do you see any contemporary images as you're doing research?
Yeah, I don't know that much about what's going on in the contemporary world. There is, I do see it, but I don't want to comment because I don't know that much about it.
Right. We see ancient conflict reflected in the art, swords and horses and chainmail and all that. So I didn't know if
the fact that they paint it on the bowl says that it's a big part of their everyday life. It's inescapable. And like I said earlier, every piece has a story, and some of these stories are incredible in terms of what story they tell with all the horses and people, the soldiers on horseback, and there's the Mongol invasion. It's clear. You can see even the imagery of the dragon, or the what they call the Asian face references. There's signs that there's a trade in culture for sure.
Are you going to give a lecture on this?
How do you replicate this? Yeah, so we've had a lot of tours coming through, yeah. So,
you guys, thank you so much for making the trip. Many of you, Carrie Hewlin in the house. Look at this. This guy came from, how long? Carrie, 5 hours?
He's trying to sneak away down.
That's my mentor right there, Carrie.
well, wait, So I do want to add, because, Mark and I feel that if you're going to drive all this way, we're really going to make it worth your while. We live across the street, kind of catty corner, and we are opening up our home after this, so everyone's invited to come join us for a meal and more drinks or whatever you want, and in our home.
You have to go. Don't leave. You have to go see their home because it's an amazing home just to see.
Well,
and the food is awesome too.
And the artwork's great.
The artwork is amazing.
It's okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank